King Charles looked directly at the royal guard and gave an order no monarch had ever spoken before. "Kneel me." The silence that followed wasn't ceremonial, it was defiant. And when the guard finally broke it, after 16 years of carrying a secret that could shake the monarchy, his words didn't just refuse a king's command, they brought back a ghost Charles thought was buried forever. So before we reveal exactly how it unfolded, first hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because this moment changed everything. You know that particular kind of December cold that cuts through London like a blade? That's exactly what greeted the Commonwealth Summit that morning at Windsor Castle, the kind of sharp, bitter air that makes your breath steam and turns every sound into something that carries twice as far as it should. The frost hadn't just settled on the castle's ancient stones, claimed them completely, turning the grey walls into something that looked carved from ice. Even the flags above the main gatehouse snapped with more violence than usual, like the weather itself was putting on a show for what was about to unfold. But none of that stopped representatives from 42 nations from taking their positions behind the velvet rope barriers. Diplomats bundled in dark overcoats, security personnel with earpieces they thought were hidden, and those rare members of the press who'd earned access to witness what everyone assumed would be routine royal pageantry. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness something that would make every other Commonwealth summit seem tame by comparison. Lance Corporal Edwin Rowntree stood at attention with the ceremonial detail, positioned third from the castle's main archway. If you saw him from across the courtyard, you'd think he was carved from the same stone as the walls behind him. 38 years old, broad-shouldered but not imposing, with the kind of weathered stillness that doesn't come from parade ground training. It comes from places where moving at the wrong moment could get you killed. The tourists taking photos from behind the barriers had no idea they were looking at a man who'd carried his wounded sergeant 4 miles through Taliban territory, who'd stood his ground during mortar attacks, in places with names that made the evening news, under circumstances that never made it into the official reports, who'd been handpicked for protection details, precisely because he could read danger in the way someone held their shoulders when they were carrying weight they shouldn't have. His commanding officer had once written in his evaluation, "Rowntree possesses an almost supernatural ability to maintain discipline under pressure. His tactical awareness and moral integrity make him an asset to any operation." That evaluation was classified, filed in a folder most people would never see. But standing there in his scarlet tunic, polished boots reflecting the winter sky, he looked like nothing more than a very expensive tourist attraction. The red tunic fit him like it had been painted on, every button in perfect alignment, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The tall black bearskin cast shadows across his face, but not enough to hide those steady grey eyes that had seen more than most people twice his age. Behind those barriers, a middle-aged woman was explaining to her teenage son how these ceremonies worked. "See? They stand perfectly still, no matter what happens. It's been that way for centuries." Her son rolled his eyes. "Seems a bit pointless, doesn't it? Just standing there while important people walk by?" What neither of them knew was that the man they were looking at had once made split-second decisions that saved lives in places where the wrong call meant body bags coming home, had kept secrets that could topple governments, had carried a letter in his breast pocket for 16 years that would change everything they thought they knew about the monarchy. But here, in the forecourt of Windsor Castle, he was just another figure in red, until the moment when silence became its own form of resistance. The younger guards called him the statue, not as a joke, but with something like nervous respect. No shortcuts, no favours, no attending the late-night pub crawls with visiting royals. And definitely no bowing to the informal power games that sometimes wormed their way into ceremonial life. But it was more than just his incorruptibility that made people nervous around Edwin Rowntree. 3 months ago, he'd done something that sent ripples through the palace hierarchy. During a private reception for arms dealers, disguised as a Defence Innovation Summit, Rowntree had been assigned security detail. When one of the guests, a Libyan contractor, recognised him and tried to strike up a conversation about mutual friends in Gibraltar, Edwin had done something unprecedented. He'd walked away from his post, not abandoned it. That would have been court-martial territory, but he'd requested immediate replacement due to what he called a personal conflict of interest. The replacement had been granted, no questions asked, but palace security had noted the incident. They'd also noted that the Libyan contractor left the reception 20 minutes later, looking visibly shaken. Word travelled fast in the corridors of power. Within a week, Edwin had been transferred from high security details to ceremonial duties only. Officially, it was described as a rotation to optimise skill sets. Unofficially, everyone understood what it really meant. They were trying to bury him in ceremony, hoping the pageantry would drown out whatever truths he carried. Which is why, as diplomats and aides and representatives took their positions, there were quiet whispers circling Edwin Rowntree's post like smoke. "He refused the dinner invitation again, didn't he?" one aide murmured, flipping through a briefing folder. "Not just refused," another answered, voice low enough not to carry. "Said he wouldn't dine with a man who signs papers with blood on them." "Is that confirmed?" The first aide shrugged. "It doesn't need to be. Look at where they've placed him." Edwin had been positioned at the far right of the primary ceremonial line, visibly present, unmistakably isolated. Not a punishment in official terms, but the kind of subtle rebuke only palace insiders would notice. As if to say, "You can stand, but you do not belong among us." He didn't mind. He hadn't minded for years. The castle doors opened with that heavy ceremonial weight that only comes from centuries of tradition. King Charles emerged, flanked by Commonwealth leaders and senior military officers, his navy overcoat buttoned against the December air. He was here for the formal welcome ceremony, but protocol demanded he inspect the guard first. The crowd straightened, phones rising, conversations dropping to respectful whispers. This was what they'd come to see. The pageantry, the precision, the living embodiment of British tradition. Charles moved down the ceremonial line with measured steps, offering small nods to each guard, the kind of formal acknowledgement that keeps these ancient wheels turning smoothly. Behind the barriers, cameras clicked softly, capturing what looked like another routine royal moment. Except as he approached Rowntree, something changed. The king's pace slowed, his eyes lingered, and for just a moment, so brief that most people missed it, his jaw tightened. Behind him, an aide in a dark overcoat leaned in close, his voice pitched low but carrying in the sharp air. "Sir, about the Rowntree situation. The file you requested this morning." Charles didn't respond, but his gaze remained fixed on the motionless guard, the same guard who'd refused 3 invitations to private dinners, who'd declined every attempt at informal conversation, who'd walked away from a security detail when a certain Libyan contractor tried to engage him in conversation about Gibraltar, who stood at his post like a living reminder of something the king would rather forget. The truth was, Charles remembered Edwin Rowntree perfectly. Not just from recent incidents, but from 16 years ago. He remembered signing the Gibraltar authorization, remembered the briefings afterward when 3 soldiers had died. And he especially remembered the younger brother who'd requested a private audience, been denied, then submitted a formal inquiry that had been buried so deep it might as well have been classified. That younger brother had spent 2 years fighting the system for answers about his brother's death. 2 years of formal requests, freedom of information appeals, letters to MPs. 2 years of being told that the operation was too sensitive to discuss, that national security prevented disclosure, that some sacrifices had to remain unacknowledged for the greater good. And then, suddenly, the inquiries had stopped. Edwin Rowntree had enlisted in the Household Division, taken the same oath his brother had taken, and served in silence for 14 years. Charles had always wondered if that silence was acceptance or something else entirely. Now he was beginning to understand it had been something else. Deep in his pocket, the aide was carrying a printed file. An internal memorandum marked Escalating Protocol. It had been reviewed that morning, and at the very bottom, beneath the layers of diplomatic briefings and ceremonial scripts, was a handwritten note from the king himself. If Rowntree remains uncooperative, engage publicly, force deference, symbolism matters. Rowntree didn't know about the note, but he knew the temperature had changed. The quiet wasn't just cold anymore, it was poised, waiting. Your Majesty, the aide continued quietly, perhaps we should address this privately, after the ceremony. That's when Charles made a decision that would echo across every front page in London by morning. He stopped walking, not dramatically, not with any grand gesture, he just stopped. The kind of stillness that makes everyone around you suddenly realise the script has changed. Behind the barriers, conversations died mid-sentence. The woman who'd been explaining ceremony to her son lowered her phone slightly. "What's happening?" Her son shushed her, but his eyes never left the scene unfolding before them. Charles turned toward the senior officer trailing behind him, a brigadier whose chest was decorated with enough medals to stock a jewellery store. "This guard," Charles said, his voice carrying just far enough for the courtyard to hear, "will demonstrate the respect due to Commonwealth unity." The reaction was immediate and electric. Behind the rope, people started murmuring. Phones that had been lowering rose again, suddenly capturing something far more interesting than routine ceremony. "Demonstrate how?" someone whispered. "What's he asking for?" came another voice. The brigadier looked confused. "Your Majesty, I am not certain I understand." Charles stepped closer to Rowntree, close enough that the difference in their heights was obvious, the king having to look up at the guard beneath his towering bearskin. "In recognition of our Commonwealth partners," Charles said, his voice now pitched for everyone to hear, "and as a gesture of the humility we owe to those we once ruled." He paused, letting the weight of 42 nations' worth of attention settle on his next words. "Kneel." The word hit the courtyard like a physical blow. Gasps swept through the crowd like wind through wheat. A woman behind the barrier grabbed her husband's arm. Did he just order him to kneel? Her husband was already filming. "This isn't normal protocol. Something's happening here." From the diplomatic section, voices erupted in urgent whispers. The High Commissioner for Nigeria stepped closer to his aide. "This is not standard ceremonial procedure." "No, sir," the aide replied, his face pale. "This is something else entirely." The Pakistani envoy turned to her security detail, speaking in rapid Urdu. The Canadian delegate was already on his phone, texting what looked like an urgent message. Most concerning of all, the South African representative, a woman who'd lived through apartheid and understood the weight of forced submission, had gone completely still, her expression unreadable. From the Jamaican delegation, a voice carried clearly, "No man should be made to kneel for show." The speaker was Dr. Marcus Campbell, a historian who'd spent decades documenting colonial resistance. His words weren't loud, but they carried the authority of someone who understood exactly what they were witnessing. The ripple effect was immediate. Other Caribbean representatives began murmuring among themselves. The Kenyan general crossed his arms, his expression grim. What had started as a ceremonial inspection was turning into something that looked uncomfortably like a test of how far a monarchy could push its power. Charles waited. The entire courtyard waited. 42 nations' worth of dignitaries and staff and security held their collective breath. But now that silence carried a different weight, it wasn't anticipation anymore, it was judgment. And Rowntree didn't move, and not a twitch, not even a blink. His rifle remained at the perfect ceremonial angle, his boots planted exactly where they'd been since dawn, his gaze fixed on that invisible point that guards are trained to focus on. The silence stretched and stretched, until it became its own kind of answer. Behind the barriers, the murmurs grew louder. Someone called out, "Why won't he do it?" Another voice answered uncertainly, "Maybe he's not allowed to break position." But those who understood military protocol knew better. This wasn't about rules, this was about something much deeper. Charles's voice sharpened. "Perhaps you didn't hear me clearly, Lance Corporal. I said, kneel." Still nothing. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the flags above, but the man in red might as well have been carved from the same stone as the castle behind him. "A simple gesture," Charles continued, his tone taking on an edge that made several aides shift uncomfortably, "to show our Commonwealth friends that Britain understands its place in the modern world." The crowd was completely focused now. Even the other guards in the line seemed to lean forward slightly, though their own discipline held them in position. A veteran in the crowd, obvious from his bearing and the regimental tie beneath his overcoat, spoke to no one in particular, but loud enough for others to hear. "That lad's not moving for a reason." "What reason?" asked the woman beside him. The veteran's expression was grim. "Same reason good soldiers sometimes disobey bad orders, because some things matter more than rank." Charles took another step closer, close enough now that his voice dropped, but somehow carried even further. "Your stubbornness embarrasses your regiment," he said, each word precisely delivered, "and it insults every Commonwealth representative standing here today." That landed like a slap. Not shouted, not crude, but surgical in its precision. At the rope barrier, people began to look genuinely uncomfortable. This wasn't the polite ceremony they'd expected to witness. An elderly woman whispered to her companion, "This feels wrong, like we're watching something private." But they couldn't look away, none of them could. "I am offering you," Charles continued, his voice gaining strength from the crowd's attention, "one final opportunity to demonstrate the respect due to your sovereign and the dignity owed to our guests." He gestured toward the gathered diplomats, many of whom now looked distinctly uncomfortable, being used as props in whatever this was becoming. "Kneel," he said, for the third time, "not to me, but to the unity we claim to represent." The words hung in the December air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Behind the king, Queen Camilla had appeared at his shoulder, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with warning. "Charles," she murmured, just loud enough for those nearby to catch. "Not here, not like this." He ignored her completely. The standoff stretched into its third minute now. Phones were steady in hands throughout the crowd, everyone sensing they were witnessing something that would be dissected and analysed for years to come. But something else was happening that most of the crowd couldn't see. The other guards in Rowntree's line, and men who'd served alongside him, who knew his reputation, who'd heard whispers about his brother, were beginning to show subtle signs of solidarity. Guard Second Class Matthews, standing 2 positions to Rowntree's left, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Not breaking position, but making it clear he was present, aware, and choosing his stance. Sergeant Williams, the most senior guard in the line, allowed his breathing to deepen slightly. Another minute gesture that spoke volumes to those who understood military bearing. They weren't breaking protocol, but they were sending a message that anyone with military experience would recognise. Touch one of us. Deal with all of us. Lieutenant General Foxley, observing from his position near the gate, caught these subtle signals immediately. His expression tightened as he realised what was developing. This wasn't just one guard refusing a royal command anymore. This was the beginning of a potential breakdown in the entire ceremonial structure. A BBC correspondent, positioned discreetly behind the press screen, whispered into her earpiece, "We're going to need expanded coverage. This is turning into something unprecedented." Her producer's voice crackled back, "How unprecedented?" She watched Charles's face, noted the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands had begun to clench behind his back. Career-ending for someone, I'm just not sure who. Behind him an aide stepped forward nervously. "Your Majesty, I must advise—" "Take his name," Charles said, cutting across the man's words. He's to be suspended immediately for gross insubordination. But before the aide could even reach for his notepad, Rowntree finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. Just enough to show he'd heard every word that had been spoken. But not to kneel. Instead, he shifted his grip on his rifle. The smallest possible adjustment, barely visible to most of the crowd. But to those who understood military bearing, it was unmistakable. He was preparing to speak. When his voice came, it was steady, clear, and loud enough for every person in that courtyard to hear. "I kneel only to God," he said, without moving his head or breaking that forward stare, "and to no man." The effect was immediate and electric. Gasps from the crowd, sharp intakes of breath from the diplomatic section, and the kind of silence that follows when someone crosses a line there's no coming back from. "Especially," Rowntree continued, each word delivered with the precision of a man who'd been waiting 16 years to say them, one who sends better men to die for his mistakes. The courtyard didn't just go quiet this time. It went dead. Utterly, completely silent. Not a whisper among the diplomats, not a creak from the other guards, not a single camera click. Just the wind and the sudden understanding that they were witnessing the kind of moment that changes everything. Charles's face went through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, anger, and then something that looked almost like fear. "You forget yourself, Lance Corporal," he said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. "You are speaking to your king." Rowntree's reply came without hesitation. "My king wouldn't have needed to ask." The words landed like artillery. Behind the barriers, people began pointing, whispering urgently to companions, some pulling out phones to call editors and superiors. This wasn't ceremony anymore. This was history breaking open. "Remove him," Charles said to the brigadier, but his voice cracked slightly on the second word. "Place him under arrest for gross insubordination." But before the officer could move, Rowntree spoke again. "Captain Andrew Rowntree," he said, still staring straight ahead. "British Army. My brother." The name hit Charles like a physical blow. His face went pale, and for a moment he seemed to forget where he was, who was watching, what was at stake. The crowd stirred like leaves in a sudden wind. Diplomats turned to each other with confused expressions. Security personnel touched their earpieces. The press section came alive with urgent whispers. "You want me to kneel?" Rowntree continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "Then explain to these Commonwealth representatives why my brother died in an operation you authorised without proper vetting." Charles tried to regain control. "This is neither the time nor place for personal grievances." "Personal?" Rowntree's voice cut across him like a blade. 3 dead soldiers in a classified operation gone wrong because someone valued diplomacy over security. That's not personal, Your Majesty. That's criminal." A woman in the crowd gasped audibly. A man near the back called out, "Let him speak!" Others began to echo the sentiment, creating a wave of sound that pressure washed the formality right out of the moment. "Operation Gibraltar," Rowntree continued, his voice steady as granite. 2008, joint training exercise with unvetted foreign assets. You signed the authorization order personally when you were Prince of Wales. Charles's aide stepped forward, alarm written across his face. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should—" "My brother wrote me a letter," Rowntree said, finally turning his head slightly, the first time he'd broken his forward gaze. "Posted it from Gibraltar 2 days before he died. Said the mission felt wrong. Said there were too many unknowns. Too many foreign operators with unclear loyalties." The courtyard was absolutely still now, every person hanging on his words. Said someone in the royal chain of command was more interested in making diplomatic friends than keeping British soldiers alive. Charles's mouth opened, then closed without sound. "But the letter wasn't all he sent me," Rowntree continued, his voice carrying a weight that made even the wind seem to hold its breath. 3 weeks after his funeral, I received a package, no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a note in Andrew's handwriting. If you're reading this, they got me. The real files are here. See. A ripple of shocked silence moved through the crowd. Even the most experienced diplomats looked stunned. Video footage from his helmet cam, audio recordings of briefings where he raised concerns about operational security, copies of authorization documents that showed the exercise had been green-lit despite multiple red flags from field intelligence. Charles took an involuntary step backward. And most damning of all, Rowntree's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried to every corner of the courtyard, a recording of the conversation where he was told to stop asking questions that could embarrass certain royal patrons of the operation. The implications hit the diplomatic section like a tsunami. Phones appeared in hands throughout the crowd. The South African representative was speaking urgently into her earpiece. The Nigerian High Commissioner had gone pale. He asked me to remember him if something went wrong, Rowntree continued, reaching into his breast pocket with careful precision. To ask the questions others wouldn't ask, to speak the truths others wouldn't speak. He withdrew a folded piece of paper, old, worn from years of handling. I've carried this letter for 16 years. Read it every morning before putting on this uniform. But I've carried those files for 16 years too, waiting for the right moment to honour my promise to him. The sight of that letter sent a ripple of understanding through the crowd. This wasn't just defiance. This wasn't even about protocol. This was memorial. This was love refusing to be silenced. You want symbols? Rowntree asked, his voice dropping but somehow carrying even further. Then let this be one. That a man can serve the crown and still remember what it cost. He carefully returned the letter to his pocket, his movements deliberate and respectful. My brother died standing, he said, resuming his perfect ceremonial posture, for a cause that was corrupted before it began, and for 16 years I have carried the memory of that lie. His gaze found Charles again, steady and unblinking. You want me to kneel? You think I should bow for optics, smile for the press? He shook his head once. I will not kneel for the man who signed his death warrant and called it diplomacy. The silence that followed was different from all the others, not empty but full of understanding, of recognition, of the weight that comes when truth finally finds its voice. From somewhere in the Commonwealth delegation, someone began to clap. Slowly at first, then others joined. The Nigerian High Commissioner, then the Jamaican security advisor, then the Australian diplomat who'd been taking notes. Within moments, half the courtyard was applauding, not the polite, measured applause of ceremony, but something deeper, something that sounded like vindication. Charles stood in the centre of it all, visibly shaken, his carefully constructed authority crumbling like ancient mortar. His aides clustered around him, whispering urgently, but he seemed not to hear them. Queen Camilla stepped closer to her husband, her voice sharp with warning. Charles, this is over. Walk away, now. For a moment he seemed frozen. Then, without a word, no order, no dismissal, no attempt to salvage the moment, he turned and walked toward the castle entrance. It wasn't retreat, it was surrender. But Camilla wasn't finished. She turned toward the senior military officer near the gate, Lieutenant General Foxley, head of Royal Ceremonial Operations, and gave a quiet, curt order. Remove him. Quietly. Foxley didn't answer at first. He looked at Rowntree, then at the soldiers still standing in the line, then at the foreign military dignitaries watching from behind their rope lines, many of whom were nodding slowly in silent approval. And then, without even looking back at her, he responded. If you remove him, Foxley said, voice calm but carrying absolute finality, you remove all of us. The tension snapped like thread. Camilla blinked. Once, that was all. But it was enough. She stepped back. The order never left her lips again. As the king disappeared through the archway, Rowntree remained exactly where he'd been since dawn. Same perfect posture, same unwavering focus. But now the crowd looked at him differently. Not as a ceremonial statue, but as something far more important. A reminder that some things cannot be commanded, some truths cannot be buried, and some men will not kneel, no matter who asks them to. Across the forecourt, officials began to murmur. The procession disbanded, not with ceremony, but with hesitation. Diplomats moved carefully, heads down, minds spinning. Reporters were already composing their leads. Security officers spoke urgently into their earpieces, not to coordinate arrests or damage control, but to confirm the obvious. The story had already broken, and the man at the centre of it all still hadn't moved. The December sun dipped lower behind the battlements, casting longer shadows across the ancient stones. The red of Rowntree's uniform caught the light like a banner against the cold. Near the back, a quiet ripple of motion stirred as guests began filing back toward the great hall. A Canadian official turned to his assistant and whispered, "I've never seen a monarchy kneel without kneeling before." And still, the guard stood. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he just stood, like his brother had, like he always would. He was no longer just a symbol of tradition. He was a fracture line, a reminder, a warning, and a vow, all carried in the quiet dignity of a man who would not be moved, even by a king. So what do you think? Was Lance Corporal Rowntree right to refuse the king's command, even in front of Commonwealth leaders? Should personal grief ever outweigh military protocol? And when the powerful demand submission, is silence or speaking truth the greater service to your country? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations shape how we tell these stories. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you that real courage doesn't need permission to speak, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell on, so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. These moments of quiet heroism happen more often than you'd think. And if you know someone who needs to see this, someone who might wonder what it really means to serve with honour, share this video with them. Your next story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over. Real loyalty isn't about following orders. It's about remembering why those orders matter in the first place. And sometimes, the most loyal thing you can do is refuse to move.